The fortress had no name that living people used anymore. It sat at the edge of the Asheville Mountains like something the world had given up trying to remove. Dark stone, towers that scraped low clouds, windows that glowed faintly even when no fire was lit inside. Locals called it simply the Dark Place, and taught their children to walk the long way around it, through the marsh, through the cold, through anything rather than cutting across the ridge where the fortress stood. For 300 years, no uninvited guest had crossed its threshold and walked back out again to talk about it. Mira crossed the threshold on a Tuesday evening, soaking wet, bleeding from a shallow cut on her palm where she had grabbed a thorn branch to stop herself from sliding down the mountain path. She had not planned to come here. She had planned to reach the village of Caldermere before dark, rent a room at the inn, eat something warm, and put as much distance between herself and the city of Varenholm as her legs could carry her in 3 days. That plan had stopped working the moment she looked over her shoulder on the mountain path and saw the figure following her, still distant, still unhurried, which somehow made it worse. Unhurried meant confident. Confident meant he knew she had nowhere else to go. She had seen the fortress and made a decision that she was already regretting, except that regretting it required being alive, and being alive required getting through the door, and the door, impossibly, had opened when she pushed it. The entrance hall was enormous and silent. Her footsteps echoed in a way that made her sound much smaller than she was. The walls were black stone inlaid with silver veins that caught the light from a chandelier hanging so high above her that she couldn't quite make out what was burning in it. Candles, maybe, or something that merely resembled candles. The air smelled like cold rain and something older underneath it, something mineral and deep, like the inside of a cave that had never been touched by sunlight. "You're dripping on my floor." The voice came from her left. Mira turned sharply, her hand going to the small knife at her belt, which she recognized immediately was a useless gesture given what she was looking at. He was standing beside a doorway she hadn't noticed, leaning against the frame in a posture that managed to look both completely relaxed and faintly threatening, the way a large cat looks relaxed when it hasn't decided yet whether to be interested in you. He was tall, not impossibly so, but tall enough that the doorframe suited him better than it would most men. Dark clothing, dark hair, the kind of face that had been put together with uncomfortable precision, all clean lines and sharp angles, expression completely unreadable. His eyes were the most immediately striking thing about him, a deep amber that caught light the way no human eye quite managed. Those eyes moved from her face to the puddle forming around her boots without any particular urgency. "I'm sorry," Mira said, which was not what she had planned to say. She had planned something practical, something with a clear request embedded in it. Instead, she was apologizing for rainwater, which felt like a terrible way to begin a negotiation with a demon lord. "Most people who enter without invitation don't apologize," he said. "They either run or they attack. You're doing neither." "I need help," she said. "Most people who need help go to temples or other people." He tilted his head slightly. "Not here. The temples are in the city. Other people talk too much." She straightened her spine, which took more effort than it should have because she was cold and tired and her hand was still bleeding. "I know what you are. I know whose castle this is. I came here because you're the only person, the only being within 40 miles who my problem can't simply overwhelm." Something shifted in his expression, too subtle to name. He was quiet for a moment in the way that very powerful things are quiet when they are deciding whether to be curious or simply dismissive. "Come in, then," he said finally. "You can explain yourself somewhere that isn't the entrance hall, and we'll do something about your hand before you bleed on anything else." His name, she already knew, was Caelum, demon lord of the Asheville region, sovereign of a territory that technically overlapped with 3 human kingdoms whose rulers had all, at various points, tried to negotiate with him and come away from those negotiations with the distinct impression that he had found the entire process mildly amusing. He was not cruel in the way that old stories describe demon lords. No piles of bones, no screaming dungeons, no theatrical darkness. What he was, by every account she had found in 3 days of frantic library research before she fled Varenholm, was entirely serious. He did not make agreements lightly. He did not say things he didn't mean. And he did not, under any circumstances, involve himself in human affairs without a reason that satisfied him. She was going to have to give him a reason that satisfied him. He led her through 2 corridors and into a room that was surprisingly livable. Bookshelves on 3 walls, a fireplace that was already burning, chairs that looked like they had been chosen for actual comfort rather than impression. He gestured toward one of them and then moved to a cabinet along the far wall without asking, returning with a cloth and a small dark bottle that smelled, when he unstoppered it, like pine resin and something sharper underneath. "Give me your hand," he said. She did, because refusing seemed both ungrateful and unwise. He cleaned the cut with the focused efficiency of someone who had done this before and found it neither particularly interesting nor unpleasant, just a task. His hands were cool, which she had expected, and careful, which she hadn't. "Talk," he said, without looking up from her palm. So she did. She told him about Edric Holt, which was the name of the man following her, though she'd stopped thinking of him as a man somewhere around the 4th month of it. Edric Holt, who had been a business associate of her late father's, who had decided, at her father's funeral 14 months ago, that Mira was something he wanted to own. Who had begun with gifts she hadn't asked for and letters she hadn't answered and had progressed, gradually, and then suddenly, to appearing outside every place she went, to knowing her schedule before she did, to making it clear through 100 small actions that no wall she built was going to stay standing. She had gone to the city guard. The city guard had spoken to Edric Holt, who was wealthy and connected, and had come back to tell her she was misinterpreting ordinary social attention. She had hired a private security firm, and Edric Holt had bought the firm. She had moved 3 times in 8 months, and he had found her each time within 2 weeks. She had, finally, concluded that staying in any city, in any place with people who could be asked questions or paid for information, was no longer safe. "And so you came up a mountain in the rain to ask a demon lord for shelter," Caelum said. He had finished with her hand and was now sitting in the chair across from her, watching her with that same unreadable expression. "What exactly were you planning to ask me to do?" She took a breath. This was the part she had rehearsed, and she was going to say it cleanly and without apology. "I want you to pretend to be my husband," she said. "I want Edric Holt to believe that I am married, that I belong to someone, because he is the kind of man who thinks of women as things to acquire, and the only language that type of man understands is ownership. If he believes I am already claimed, by someone powerful enough to make the claim meaningful, he will stop. He has to stop. Not because he has any decency in him, but because he is also a coward, and a coward only pursues a target that seems unprotected." The fire crackled. Caelum looked at her for a long, thoughtful moment. "Pretend," he said. "Yes, pretend. A performance, for as long as it takes to make him believe it and go away." "No," he said. The word landed very simply in the room. Not unkindly, but with a kind of finality that she recognized as genuinely meaning no, not as a bargaining opener. "No pretending," he said. "If you want to stay here, and if you want protection from this man, then we do it properly or we don't do it at all. I don't perform. I don't play roles. If Edric Holt comes to this mountain asking about you, I will not tell him a story. I will tell him the truth as it actually stands, or I will tell him nothing and remove him from my territory by whatever means is appropriate." He paused. "So the question is not whether I will pretend. The question is whether you are willing to make this real." Mira stared at him. "You're suggesting we actually get married," she said slowly. "You and me, actually." "I am telling you the terms under which I would agree to your request," he said. You came here with a proposal. I'm adjusting the terms of it. That's how negotiations work. Outside, the rain hammered against the stone walls of the fortress. Somewhere far down the mountain, she was quite certain, Edric Holt was finding shelter and waiting for morning. I don't know anything about you, she said. You know enough to climb my mountain in the dark, he said. And I know enough about you to find this conversation more interesting than most I've had in the last decade. That's a reasonable starting point. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Why would you want this? What do you actually get from it? He considered the question seriously, which she appreciated. He didn't deflect it or wave it away. I've governed this territory for 300 years, he said. I have power, resources, and a great deal of time. What I have had in that span is very little company worth keeping. He looked at her steadily. You walked into my castle with a bleeding hand and negotiated with me before you'd even caught your breath. I find that worth something. Mira sat with that for a moment. The fire was warm. Her hand no longer hurt. I'll think about it, she said. Take your time, he said. You'll sleep here tonight regardless. The mountain is no place for anyone after dark, even without a man following you. He stood and moved toward the door, pausing at the threshold. There are 4 guest rooms on the 2nd floor, he said. The one at the end of the hall has a better view and extra blankets. I'd suggest that one. He left. Mira sat alone in the warm room with the bookshelves and the fire, listening to the rain, thinking about what it meant when a demon lord said no pretending. She was surprised to find that the word reel didn't frighten her as much as it probably should have. She slept deeply and without dreams, which she credited to the exhaustion of 3 days of running rather than to any particular comfort with her situation, though the bed in the end room was genuinely the best she'd slept in since her father died, and everything in her life had started unraveling. She woke to gray morning light and the smell of something cooking, which surprised her. She had not imagined a demon lord doing anything as ordinary as preparing food. She found him in a kitchen that was large and well-stocked and surprisingly warm, standing at a heavy iron stove with the focused attention of someone who was doing a task they had decided was worth doing correctly. He had changed clothes from the night before, still dark, but more casual, the kind of clothing that said he lived here rather than performed here. He did not look up immediately when she came in, which she appreciated. It gave her a moment to gather herself before being observed. Sit, he said without turning around. There's tea on the table. The bread is almost done. You cook, she said, sitting down. I've lived alone for 300 years. The alternatives were to cook or to let servants into my home. He did glance at her then, briefly. I chose to cook. The tea was good, something dark and slightly smoky, the kind that required an opinion to make properly. The bread came off the stove in a heavy pan and was set between them along with soft butter and a jar of something dark and sweet that turned out to be plum preserve. They ate for a moment in the kind of quiet that Mira, who had grown up in a house full of people, had only recently learned to stop filling with words. You're watching me think, she said eventually. I'm watching you eat and think simultaneously, he said. You do it efficiently. You haven't wasted a single expression. I've been deciding things for myself for a while now, she said. You learn to think quickly. Have you come to any decision about last night's conversation? She set down her bread. I have questions first. That's reasonable, he said. If this were real, she said, choosing the word deliberately, what would it actually look like? I'm not a demon. I can't live 300 years. I have a life, or I had one before Edric Holt made it impossible. I have things I wanted to do. I was a cartographer. I made maps. I had commissions, projects, a workshop in Varenholm. She paused. I'm not saying no. I'm saying I need to understand what yes actually means before I say it. Caelum was quiet for a moment, and she appreciated that too. He didn't rush to reassure her, didn't fill the silence with promises he was making up on the spot. You could continue your work here, he said. The fortress has space enough, and I have maps going back 2 centuries that no one has updated since the cartographer who made them died. The territory I govern has changed considerably: coastlines, forests, towns that have grown or disappeared. There's genuine work to be done if you wanted it." He paused. "As for the difference in our natures, I won't pretend that's simple. You would grow old. I won't. That's a real thing to sit with, and I won't diminish it by offering you easy comfort about it. What I can tell you is that the time you have, whatever its length, would be yours to use as you chose. I don't believe in cages." "But you'd be my husband," she said. "In name, in practice. In every way that you chose to make it, and in no way that you didn't," he said. "I'm not asking you to become something else. I'm offering to become something to you. Those are different things." Mira looked at him across the table. In the morning light, without the drama of the entrance hall and the dark and the rain, he was still striking, but differently so, more present, somehow more actual. She could see that his amber eyes moved like real eyes, tracking thought, adjusting to light, not performing their own beauty but simply existing behind it. "You said last night that you found this conversation more interesting than most in the last decade," she said. "What does a decade feel like to you? I'm trying to understand the scale of your experience." He seemed almost to appreciate the question, not in a pleased way, but in the way of someone who rarely gets asked something they find genuinely worth answering. "A decade to me is approximately what a year is to you," he said. "Not in feeling exactly, but in significance. I notice decades the way you notice years, a passage, a change, something that happened in that time that I'll remember later. A year to me is approximately a season to you. It passes, things happen in it, but it doesn't feel like very much when I look back." He turned his teacup slowly in his hands. "Which is to say that, when I told you last night that you were the most interesting company I'd had in a decade, I meant that in the way you might mean it about a very good year. Not casually, not as flattery, as an accurate statement about what my experience has been." "That's lonely," she said, without intending to say it aloud. "Yes," he said, without any defensiveness at all. "It is." They sat with that for a moment, and it was one of those moments where something honest has been said, and both people in the conversation feel the weight of it settling properly. "Tell me about Edric Holt," he said, shifting them gently. "Not the history, you gave me that last night. Tell me what he actually wants, not what he says he wants, what the real thing is." Mira thought about it seriously. "Control," she said. "He's a man who's never been told no by anything he considered worth having. My father said no, turned down a business partnership, which Edric wanted very badly. My father died before Edric could make him change his mind. And then there I was, my father's daughter, my father's inheritor, and I said no too. The first time he sent flowers, the first time he sent letters, the first time he appeared at my door, no, no, no." She looked at her tea. "I think I became a problem he needed to solve, not because he loves me. He doesn't love me. He doesn't see me. He sees a refusal that needs to be converted into a yes. Then he won't be convinced by a certificate or a story," Caelum said. "He'd need to see something that convinced him the yes was definitively unavailable, something that cost him the sense that he could still win." "That's why I came here," she said. "Because you're the only thing I could think of that he couldn't outbuy or outmaneuver." "He'll come here," Caelum said. It wasn't a question. "He followed me up a mountain in the rain," she said. "Yes, he'll come here." Caelum nodded slowly. "Then let him come." He said it in the tone of someone accepting a delivery rather than preparing for a confrontation, calm, practical, slightly inconvenienced, but not alarmed. "You're not worried," she said. "No," he said simply. "Should I be?" "He's dangerous. He has money, connections, men who work for him." "He has money, connections, and men," Caelum said. "I have 300 years of practice, a territory that bends to my authority, and no particular patience for men who pursue what doesn't want to be caught." He looked at her. "He's dangerous to you. That's different from dangerous in general. Myra sat back in her chair, something in her chest releasing very slightly. A tension she'd been carrying so long she'd stopped noticing its weight. She recognized the feeling and was suspicious of it. She had learned, in the last year, to be suspicious of anything that felt like relief. "What would you need from me?" she asked. "If we actually did this, what would you need that would make it work?" "Honesty," he said without hesitating. "Tell me when something doesn't work for you. Don't perform contentment. Don't manage my feelings about how you're doing. I've lived long enough to find pretense exhausting, and I'd rather know what's actually true than be handled." He paused. "I'd also ask that you treat this place like your home rather than your refuge. Those are different. A refuge is temporary and held at arm's length. A home is something you put yourself into." "And what would I have from you in return?" "Safety," he said. "Genuinely, not the kind that depends on guards or walls or weapons, but the kind that comes from something with real authority over this territory saying clearly and absolutely that you are not available for anyone's pursuit. Space to do your work. Honesty in return for yours." He paused again, and this time something shifted very slightly in his expression, something that wasn't quite the controlled steadiness he'd maintained through the whole conversation. "Company," he said quietly. "For whatever that's worth to you." It was worth quite a lot, she thought. She just didn't say so yet. "I'll need to write to a colleague in Varenholm," she said. "I have maps half-finished, materials, equipment. I'd need them brought here." "I can arrange that," he said. "And I'd need to understand the territory I'd be mapping. Walk it with me, explain its geography, tell me what's changed." "I'd be glad to," he said, and she noticed the difference between his saying that and what the same words would have sounded like from a man trying to please her. He said it as someone who actually wanted to. "All right," she said. "All right," he repeated. "All right, yes," she said. "We do this properly, as you said, no pretending." She met his amber eyes steadily. "But slowly. I want to do this as two people who are still learning each other, not as a performance in either direction." "Slowly," he agreed. "That I can do. I have nothing but time." "Don't say that," she said. "I have considerably less." "Then we'll make the most of what there is," he said, and it didn't sound like a consolation. It sounded like a genuine intention, which was something else entirely. Later that morning, he showed her the library, 3 rooms connected by narrow doorways, shelves from floor to ceiling, a rolling ladder on a brass rail, maps in flat drawers that pulled out from a cabinet so large it must have been built inside the room rather than brought through the door. She pulled out a map of the coastline from 160 years ago and compared it mentally against what she knew the coast looked like now. And the discrepancy was significant. Inlets that had become beaches, a river that had shifted a quarter-mile east, a settlement that the map showed as a village and she knew to be a substantial town. "This is a lot of work," she said. "Yes," he said from beside her, looking down at the old map with her. "Good," she said, and meant it completely. Edric Holt arrived 11 days later. Myra knew he was coming before he arrived because Caelum told her, not dramatically, not as a warning designed to frighten her, but practically, the way you tell someone about whether that's heading their way. He'd been aware of Holt's approach since the man crossed the ridge at the base of the mountain, which was the outer boundary of his territory, and he mentioned it over dinner with the same tone he might have used to mention that it was going to rain tomorrow. "He's brought 3 men with him," Caelum added, pouring wine that was older than any nation Myra could name. "They're making camp at the lower slope. He'll come up to the fortress in the morning, most likely." "He always liked to arrive in daylight," Myra said. "He thinks it makes him look reasonable." "He wants to see your face when you open the door," Caelum said. "That's what men like him want, the expression of someone who thought they'd gotten away." Myra set down her fork. "What happens tomorrow?" "Whatever you want to happen," he said. "You can be nowhere visible and I'll speak to him alone, or you can be present, your choice. She thought about it for a moment. I want to be present, she said. I don't want to spend the rest of my life hiding from his arrival, and I want him to see, she stopped. See what? He asked. That I'm not afraid, she said. I want him to see that, because I'm not anymore. She said this with some surprise in her own voice, as if she was noticing it for the first time as she spoke. I don't know exactly when that stopped. Caelum looked at her across the dinner table. Across the map she had been working on all afternoon that was still spread at one end of the table, because neither of them had moved it for dinner, just eaten around it the way people do when the work is ongoing, and the life fits around the work rather than the other way around. Something in his expression was quiet and attentive, and not trying to be anything other than what it was. Around the 4th day, I think, he said. Was it that obvious? You started leaving doors open, he said. When you first arrived, every room you went into, you closed the door. By the 4th day, you stopped. Mira hadn't noticed herself doing it. She thought about it now, the first days of careful, self-contained caution, the gradual release of the bracing tension she'd carried so long it had become posture, something she did with her body without thinking. The fortress had expanded gradually in her awareness from a temporary shelter to something she moved through with her full attention. She knew where things were. She'd reorganized 2 of the library's map drawers without asking permission, and he hadn't said anything except to note, a day later, that he'd been looking for the 1680 coastal survey and had found it exactly where she'd moved it, which was more sensible than where it had been. Tomorrow, she said, we face him together. Together, he agreed, without any ceremony about it. She didn't sleep badly that night, which continued to surprise her about herself. She lay in the room at the end of the hall that had become, in 11 days, genuinely hers in the quiet way that rooms become yours when you start putting things on the surfaces without calculating whether you have the right to her ink set, her measuring tools, a book she was halfway through, a cup she preferred to all the others in the kitchen because it was slightly too large and held exactly the right amount of tea. In the morning, she dressed carefully. Not in armor, not in performance. She chose a dark green coat she'd had since before any of this started, good wool, well-made, the kind of clothing that said she was not on the run. She came downstairs to find Caelum already in the entrance hall, and the small acknowledgement in his expression when he saw her was worth more than any elaborate greeting. They heard the knock at the gate. It was more of a strike than a knock, the kind of impact made by someone who hits doors like a statement, and Caelum walked to it at his own pace and opened it without hurry. Edric Holt had not changed in the months since Mira had last seen him. He was a handsome man in the way that certain kinds of men are handsome, constructed handsomeness, the result of money spent on clothes and grooming, and the good nutrition that wealth guarantees. He was in his late 40s, graying at the temples in a way someone had probably told him was distinguished. His 3 men were behind him at a respectful distance, close enough to be a statement and far enough to be deniable. His eyes went first to Caelum and then, immediately, to Mira. He had not expected to see her standing there. She watched him process it, the way his expression moved through surprise, then a kind of recalculation, then a version of his public face that he used for situations he needed to manage. Mira, he said, with warmth he had no right to. I've been so worried. When you left the city without a word. She left Varenholm in good order, Caelum said. His voice was completely even, not hostile, simply factual, the way someone reads a document aloud. She arrived here 11 days ago. She is well. Edric looked at Caelum with the assessing gaze of someone measuring a competitor. And you are. The owner of the territory you have entered without invitation, Caelum said, which I'm choosing to treat as ignorance rather than disrespect, for now. Who are you, and what is your business here? The phrasing was deliberate, reducing Edric to someone who had to introduce himself and explain his presence, on Caelum's ground, at Caelum's door. Myra watched Edric absorb this and adjust. "Edric Holt," he said. "I'm an old family friend of Myra's. When she disappeared, I became concerned. I've come to see that she's safe and to invite her to return home." "This is her home," Caelum said. A pause. "I'm sorry." "This is Myra's home." No elaboration. No explanation offered beyond the fact itself. Edric's eyes moved back to Myra. He had a way of looking at her that she had always found suffocating, an intensity that disguised itself as devotion, but was actually something closer to inventory. She met the look and felt, with a clear and quiet surprise, that it passed over her without catching on anything. The hook had nothing to snag. "Myra," he said, "I think there's been some confusion, or perhaps pressure of some kind." His voice shifted slightly, taking on the particular tone of someone who believes they are being very subtle. "You don't have to stay somewhere you don't want to be. You can come back with me. I'll take care of everything." "I'm exactly where I want to be," she said. It was the most straightforward sentence she had spoken to him in 14 months, and it felt like something solidifying in her, a beam settling into a wall. "You heard her," Caelum said. He said it pleasantly, which was, Myra realized, more uncomfortable to receive than anger would have been. Pleasantness from someone who had no need to be angry because they had no need to be anything but entirely calm. Edric looked back at Caelum. He was doing math. She could see it happening, measuring the distance between what he'd walked into expecting and what was actually here, calculating whether there was an angle he could use. "I'd like to speak with her privately," Edric said. "No," Caelum said. "She's a grown woman. She can make her own decisions about who she speaks to." "She made them," Caelum said. "She's made quite a lot of decisions in the 11 days she's been here. I find her decision-making to be excellent." A pause. "She made a decision about you some time ago. I'd take it at face value." "With respect," Edric said, and the with respect was doing very heavy lifting. "I don't know who you are or what your relationship to Myra is, but I have known her family for 20 years, and I have legitimate concern for her welfare. And I don't think that a closed door and a conversation in a corridor is." "My wife's welfare is well attended to," Caelum said. The words landed in the space between them like a stone dropped into still water, and Myra watched the rings spread. She watched Edric's careful, managed expression do something she had never seen it do before, which was genuinely falter. Edric stopped. "Wife," Caelum said, with the mildest possible tone, as if clarifying something unremarkable. "If there's a specific concern about her welfare that you believe is unaddressed, you're welcome to state it plainly and I'll respond to it. Otherwise, you've confirmed that she is well and present and exactly where she has chosen to be, which was your stated reason for coming. That reason is satisfied." Edric's eyes went to Myra one more time. She saw it then, the thing underneath the pursuit, the thing that was not love and not desire, but was, in its purest form, the refusal to accept a world in which he didn't get what he'd decided he wanted. She saw it and felt, again, nothing catching. He was a man holding a hook with no water under him. "This isn't over," he said, quietly enough that his men probably didn't hear, and she understood that this was for her, a private message meant to stay with her and do its work later in the silence of a room alone. "Yes, it is," she said just as quietly. "I think you should go." He stood for another moment in the door of the fortress, and Caelum simply waited, not tensed, not positioned, just present in the way that something immovable is present, without drama, without effort, simply there. And Edric Holt, who had never in his life been truly confronted with something he couldn't buy or threaten or outlast, turned around and walked back down the mountain. Caelum closed the door. The sound of it settling into the frame was extraordinarily satisfying. Myra stood in the entrance hall for a moment, listening to the quiet. "You said wife," she said. "It's what you are," he said. "You agreed to this properly." There hasn't been a ceremony. There's been no formal. In this territory, he said, I am the formal. My word is the record. He paused. If you want a ceremony, we can have a ceremony. I'll admit the last one I attended was in 1743, and I found it somewhat long, but the principle is sound. Mira laughed. It came out of her completely unprepared, a real laugh, the kind she hadn't produced in so long that she'd half forgotten it was hers. She covered her mouth with her hand out of sheer surprise at herself. He looked at her with an expression that was the closest to warmth she'd yet seen on his face. Not soft, exactly, but genuinely directed, like light from a source that didn't usually point that way. You should do that more, he said. Laugh. Yes. I'll try, she said, and she thought she probably would. Winter came to the Asheville Mountains, the way Mira had been told it would by the 2 books she'd found in the library written by people who'd actually studied this particular region. Suddenly, and completely, and without apology. She woke one morning in early November to find 3 feet of snow on the ground and more coming down in the thick, unhurried way of snowfall that had decided to stay. And she stood at the window of the end room with her morning tea and watched it happen with something that she recognized, with some private astonishment, as contentment. She had been in the fortress for 4 months. She had mapped 2/3 of the southern coastline using a combination of Caelum's old surveys, her own observational notes from the walks they'd taken along the ridge and through the lower valley, and the very specific local knowledge that 300 years of living in a place accumulates in a person. He knew where a stream had shifted course after a flood in 1798. He knew which forest was older and which had grown up on the site of a cleared settlement. He could describe what the mountain's eastern face had looked like before a rockslide in the 1850s changed its profile, and she had used that information to understand why the current topography didn't match the elevation surveys she'd been working from. The work was good. She had not expected how much it would matter that the work was good, that she had woken up every morning in this strange and ancient place with something to do that was actually hers, that used her training, that produced something real and lasting and useful. When you spend months running from something, your entire life contracts around the running. Everything else becomes secondary. She had forgotten what it felt like to be a cartographer rather than simply a fugitive. The remembering had been gradual, and then all at once, like the snow. Caelum had left her to it largely, which she had also not expected. She had braced herself in those first weeks for some version of oversight, the natural authority of someone in whose territory she was living, some quiet monitoring of what she did and when. Instead, he had given her the map drawers and the library and the entire southern section of the fortress as a workspace, and then done his own work, which was the management of a supernatural territory that included mediating a land dispute between 2 villages, resolving something she couldn't entirely follow involving a spirit that lived in the mountain's western watershed, and corresponding with 3 demon lords in neighboring territories about a matter of boundary that had apparently been unresolved since 1904 and had recently become pressing again. They ate dinner together every night. They had started taking walks together in the afternoon when the weather allowed, which served both of them. She collected geographic observations, and he walked his territory in the way that ancient things periodically need to, not for exercise, but for something like maintenance, a regular reestablishment of presence. They talked on these walks with the ease of 2 people who have stopped performing for each other and have arrived somewhere more interesting. She learned things about him that she hadn't expected to learn. He read obsessively, not strategically, not to gather information for any purpose, but the way some people eat, with appetite and without fully being able to stop once started. He had opinions about novels that surprised her by being both strong and specific. He had found human literature in the 18th century and described the discovery in the same tone someone might use to describe finding a door in their house they hadn't noticed before. He did not sleep the way she did. He rested, several hours each night in something quieter and slower than sleep, more like the deep stillness of a mountain than the busy dark of a dreaming mind. On the nights when she woke early and the fortress was fully silent, she sometimes sat in the library and read. And once he found her there at 4 a.m. with a third cup of tea and a book she'd pulled from a high shelf. And instead of going back to wherever he'd been, he pulled a chair to the opposite side of the reading table and read beside her for 2 hours without either of them saying anything, which had been one of the finest mornings she'd spent in recent memory. He didn't touch her without reason, which she appreciated, and then gradually began to notice in a different way, not as restraint that constrained her, but as a deliberate respect that had its own particular quality. When he did touch her, it was always purposeful and present, steadying her arm on a slippery path, handing her something across a table, pointing out a detail on a map by placing his finger precisely on the thing he meant. Each small contact arrived as itself rather than as an attempt at something else, and that clarity was its own kind of warmth. She had been thinking about it differently, gradually, over the months. In the beginning, she had categorized what was between them as an arrangement with certain genuine qualities. Now, she was less sure that arrangement was the right word, and increasingly sure that whatever the right word was, it was one she was approaching from one direction and he was approaching from the other, and at some point they were going to arrive at it together. On the evening of the first heavy snowfall, they ate dinner by the fire in the room with the bookshelves, because the main dining room was too far from any fireplace to be comfortable once the temperature dropped below a certain point, and they had gradually migrated there over the last month. She had brought one of her coastal maps to show him the progress, and they spread it between the dishes, and she explained what she'd done with the inlet data, and he suggested a correction to the northern headland based on what he remembered it looking like in the 1890s. And she made a note in the margin the way she did with all his contributions, in a different color so she could track where her direct survey data ended and his historical knowledge began. "Edric Holt has left the region," he said, while she was finishing the note. He'd mentioned Holt's movements twice since the morning in the entrance hall, not as reports, just as information he'd gathered the way he gathered all information about his territory and mentioned when it seemed relevant. "When?" she asked. 3 weeks ago, he returned to Varenholm." A pause. "I don't believe he'll come back." Mira thought about how she felt about this and found, to her own mild surprise, that she felt very little about Edric Holt specifically. Not relief, not triumph, not the complex bitterness that his name had carried for over a year. She felt mainly that a thing which had been present was now absent, the way weather passes. "Good," she said, and went back to her map notation. They were quiet for a moment. "You could go back," Caelum said, "to Varenholm, if that's what you wanted. With things as they are now, the original concern has resolved." She looked up from the map. He was watching the fire, not her, an uncharacteristic moment of not looking, which she'd come to understand as his equivalent of giving her space for something he thought needed space. "Is that what you think I should do?" she asked. "It's not my place to think that," he said. "You can have an opinion," she said. "I can handle your opinions." He did look at her then. "I have a great deal of interest in your staying," he said, plainly. "I'm not going to pretend otherwise, but what I have interest in and what's correct for you are different categories." "What if they're not different?" she said. "In this case." He was quiet for a moment. Something in his expression moved, that barely perceptible shift that she had learned, over 4 months, to read the way you learn to read difficult handwriting. Not illegible, just requiring practice. "Mira," he said, with a kind of careful precision, "I have been doing my best to be honest with you since the night you walked in. That requires me to tell you that what began as an arrangement I offered for practical reasons has become, over the last 4 months, something quite different to me. And I'm aware that you came here under difficult circumstances, and that it would be entirely understandable if what seemed reasonable in November was something you wanted to reconsider in the spring, when it was warmer and safer, and there were more options available. "You're giving me an exit," she said. "I'm trying to make sure you know you have one," he said. "There's a difference." "I know I have one," she said. She put down her pen. "Caelum, do you know what I thought about while I was looking at that map this afternoon?" "No," he said. "I thought about the spring survey, and whether the snowmelt would have changed the creek bed in the northern valley enough to be worth resurveying, and whether I wanted to try for the eastern mountains in May or wait until June when the weather would be more reliable." She paused. "I was thinking about next year. I was planning for next year in this place, and it didn't feel like a compromise or a plan B, it felt like my actual life." He looked at her for a long moment. "I'd wait until June," he said quietly. "The eastern passes are unpredictable in May." "See," she said, "that's the kind of thing that's very difficult to replace." The fire moved. Outside, the snow continued to fall, that steady, unhurried accumulation that would be there in the morning and the morning after and all through the winter until it wasn't. Mira looked at him across the spread map, across the dishes, across 4 months of dinners and walks and mornings in the library and conversations that had built themselves up gradually into something that had both weight and warmth, the way stone holds heat after a long day of sun. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. "I want to be clear about that. I don't want you to keep holding an exit open because you think the generous thing is to leave my options available. The option I'm interested in is the one where I stay here and finish the coastal maps and start on the Eastern Range in June and eat dinner with you and argue about 18th century literature and occasionally convince you to tell me what the mountain looked like 300 years ago." "You want to stay," he said. Not a question, more the thing you say when you need to let a word land in the right place. "I want to stay," she said. "As your wife, actually, not as an arrangement, not as an original practical solution that happened to work out, as what this has genuinely become." He was very still for a moment in the way of someone who is receiving something carefully, making sure not to move too quickly and disturb it. "Then you'll stay," he said, "and I'll make sure that remains a decision you're glad of." "I'm already glad of it," she said. She picked her pen back up and went back to the map, and he reached across and pointed at a curve in the coastline near the northern headland. "This bay," he said. "The name on your map is wrong. It was renamed in 1812 after a local dispute that I never found satisfactory, but the original name was Ashmore Bay, and I'd put it back if you're willing." "I'll put it back," she said, uncapping a different ink. "Tell me how to spell it." He spelled it. She wrote it in. The map was more correct than it had been, and the fire was warm, and the snow outside was doing what snow does, quietly, steadily, without any particular fuss, making the world over into something new. There had been no ceremony. He was right that there hadn't needed to be one. What had happened instead was something more difficult to schedule and more impossible to fake. Two people learning each other seriously, in good faith, over the long middle stretch of ordinary days where character becomes undeniable. She had learned that he was patient without being passive, principled without being rigid, and lonely in a way that hadn't made him smaller but had made him very careful about what he let himself want. He had learned, she knew, because he had told her directly, on a walk in October when they were high enough on the ridge that the valley was spread below them like one of her maps, that she was someone who thought clearly under pressure, cared accurately rather than generally, and had a quality that he described, after a long pause searching for the right word, as durability. Not toughness, exactly. Not hardness. The thing that stays itself through difficulty without becoming something else. She had taken that as the most genuine compliment she had received in years. Outside, the snow reached 4 feet, then 5. Inside, the fire burned as long as they sat beside it, which was very late, because neither of them was particularly tired, and there was more to talk about, and neither of them was inclined to rush the evening to its end. He told her about the winter of 1891, which had buried the fortress to the first-floor windows and lasted 6 months, and she listened with genuine interest, and then said that she wanted to document it properly, the historical weather patterns of the region, and he said that he had kept records since 1700, and she was welcome to them. This, she thought, was what it looked like when something was real, not the moment of dramatic declaration, not the gesture or the ceremony or the scene that proved itself through intensity. This, the maps and the fire and the long evenings and the records going back to 1700 and the plan to survey the eastern mountains in June. The work and the conversation and the dinner and the person across from you who knew how to spell the original name of the bay on your map and told you without making a performance of it. This was what he had offered her that first night when he said no pretending. She had thought at the time that it was an obstacle, a complication to navigate, a condition she would have to manage. She understood now that it had been a gift, the only kind worth giving. She picked up her teacup and it was empty, and she set it down, and he picked it up without asking and went to the kitchen, and she heard the familiar sounds of him moving around in there, the particular rhythm of it, the specific ordinary music of someone who lived in the same space as you and knew where things were. He came back with 2 cups and set hers in front of her and sat back down and looked at the map she'd been working on, at the corrected name in the new ink. Ashmore Bay, he read. As it should be, she said. As it should be, he agreed, and picked up his own cup, and that was that, and the fire kept burning, and the snow kept falling, and the evening continued the way good evenings do, without hurrying toward any end, because there was nowhere it needed to be except exactly where it already was.